Please like, comment, and subscribe as it does help out the channel.
Good afternoon. We'll update the TWA crash story and join the Oprah Winfrey Show in a couple of minutes. First, the very latest on the crash of Flight 800. Federal safety officials and the FBI and New York City law officials have been all over the scene in the Atlantic Ocean, some 10 miles south of East Moriches on Long Island. There have been reports from a New York congressman that one of the plane's flight recorders had been found, but investigators so far are denying that report. We also know that 16 students and 5 teachers from Montoursville, PA, a small town upstate near Williamsport, were on that plane, and 4 people with ties to the Channel 6 viewing area were also on the plane. More than 100 bodies have been recovered. Officials say there's virtually no chance that anybody survived, and the latest TWA report indicates 210 passengers and a crew of 18 were on the plane. Now, we have several live reports to bring you.
On July 17, 1996, around 8:19 p.m., Trans World Flight 800 took off from JFK International Airport. Planning on stopping in Paris, then eventually landing in Rome, the plane wouldn't make it to either of these locations. Around 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane would explode, killing all 230 passengers on board. The plane would eventually crash into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of New York. The official story from the National Transportation Safety Board says that a short circuit on some of the plane's wiring caused an ignition of fuel and air in the center wing fuel tank. It says that the cause of the plane's demise was unlikely to be a lightning or meteor strike, small explosive device, or missile fragment. It also names some other causes that are unlikely. But what if it wasn't a short circuit? What if it wasn't the fuel tank that exploded, causing the plane to plummet to its watery demise? What if it was a missile fired from a U.S. Navy vessel? Christina Borgeson was a journalist for CBS who became interested in the TWA 800 debacle. She began researching it and was subsequently stonewalled when trying to get information. While in New York, Borgeson and another journalist named Kelly O'Meara had their car broken into. The only things missing were O'Meara's computer and their research on TWA 800. Borgeson says that the lock on the trunk was intact and worked fine. Who broke into their car? I don't know, this seems kinda amateurish. Break into a car and steal vital documents that could implicate some very influential and powerful people in a cover-up, but don't steal anything else to try to make it look like a standard run-of-the-mill robbery. Did they just hire some retard off Craigslist that can pick locks? Borgeson assembled a book called Into the Buzzsaw that featured essays from journalists about their experience working in the field. It showed many of the journalists experiencing pushback from higher-ups in the news corporations they work for, as well as pushback from the U.S. government. Her involvement with the TWA 800 case was included in the book, as well as the story of David E. Hendricks, a journalist who had similar trouble getting answers on TWA 800. Jim Sanders was another important voice along with Borgeson in pushing the alternative theory of why TWA 800 went down. He eventually wrote a book that came out the year after the crash in 1997. Sanders was formerly a Seal Beach, California police investigator who worked on crash scene and forensic investigations. He became an investigative reporter writing books on POWs from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He and his wife were prosecuted for allegedly conspiring to steal material from the wreckage of TWA Flight 800, which is pretty funny considering the actions of FBI agents we'll talk about later. Sanders had a source known only as Hangar Man at the time, who was an investigator working on the TWA 800 wreckage. Hangar Man snuck out a copy of the assessment of the plane's debris field, which brought into question the theory of the center wing tank being the source of the explosion that ripped the plane apart. Sanders also was told about a strange red residue on the plane's seats. This revelation caused Sanders to get sucked deeper into the investigation, with him and his wife Elizabeth asking one of her friends, who was an investigator on the crash, to bring them a scraping of the residue on the seats from the plane. This friend was Terrell Stacy, a senior TWA pilot assigned to investigate the crash. Elizabeth had met him from working for Trans World Airlines training flight attendants. It seems like Stacy was the Hangar Man source, which would make sense, but I can't really tell if they're the same person. I'm sure there was more than one person working on the crash that knew something fishy was going on. Another major figure in this story was Jim Kallstrom, the head of the FBI's investigation into the crash. Kallstrom clashed with proponents of the alternative missile-friendly fire theory. I found this excerpt of a book written about the crash called In the Blink of an Eye, the FBI Investigation of TWA Flight 800 by Pat Milton. It talks about on the night of the crash, Kallstrom was whining and dining with CIA, Secret Service, ATF, judges, and prosecutors. And obviously all these guys know each other, so it's not really a surprise, but it puts the system of power as it pertains to this story into perspective. One of the captains, about 2 minutes before the end of the recording and the start of the destruction of the plane, said, quote, "Look at that crazy fuel flow indicator there on number 4, unquote. This is touted by Wikipedia as showing that the wires were faulty, leading to the explosion minutes later. It's true that this does seem to indicate that the wires were acting up and not performing as normal, but there's quite a bit of evidence to the contrary. Terrell Stacy would eventually get the scraping of the residue, and Sanders would have it tested in a lab. The test showed that the sample was consistent with solid rocket missile fuel. This evidence was later used in the trial of Jim Sanders and his wife. The court said he was not protected under his First Amendment right, and along with his wife, was sentenced to probation and community service in 1999 for stealing materials from the wreckage. Sanders would also ship a sample of the residue to Borgeson, who left it in her producer's desk until she could find a lab to analyze it. This seemed like a major play in the fight against the official story, but soon the FBI found out about the sample and confiscated it. First, the FBI claimed the residue was trace amounts of ingredients of explosives that were spilled or somehow left behind during a training exercise involving bomb-sniffing dogs. The ingredients would be placed on a grounded plane and then the dogs would be brought in to see if they could detect them. Well, that's absolute bullshit. Just absolute insulting poppycock. Let me explain. The test was carried out on a 747 at St. Louis Airport around a month before the July 17th crash. The plane was designated Flight 800, but Flight 800 was changed to a different plane before the crash. So the test was not conducted on the plane that exploded on July 17th, 1996, and it would have been impossible anyways. Officer Herman Burnett conducted the test and said it started at 11:45 a.m. and ended around 12:15 p.m. Burnett didn't look at or record the tail number of the plane he did the test on, but the plane that crashed had a tail number of 17119. TWA records show that this plane left the gate at 12:35 p.m. with 400 passengers on board. It would take more than 20 minutes for that many people and crew to board and get situated for takeoff. Also, TWA regulations require crew to be on the plane an hour before takeoff. So hypothetically, if this test was done on the plane that crashed, and if the crew were following the rules, they would have encountered the officer. After the bomb-sniffing dog story, they decided to add on to the lie, with the FBI claiming that the residue was adhesive that was used on the seats. The specific adhesive was called Scotch Grip 1357 High Performance Contact Adhesive, made by the multinational multi-industry conglomerate 3M. A NASA chemist carried out the test on the residue for the feds and said that there was some adhesive in the sample, but there was also other materials. He said the same substances were in adhesive, but in smaller quantities. And also bonding agents are common ingredients in rocket fuel, so it's not a surprise they showed up on the test. He said that there were other tests he could have done to see if there were traces of rocket fuel, but the NTSB did not allow these tests. Also, apparently this particular Scotch Grip 1357 adhesive is a gray-green to light yellow color, not red. So do with that what you will. Physicist Tom Stalcup oversaw tests of the glue soaked in seawater to replicate how the residue was found, and the composition was different from Jim Sanders' sample. Quote, "The results are clearly different. The glue, a specific 3M brand adhesive, Scotch Grip 1357, contains no silicone, a common solid rocket fuel ingredient, while Sanders' sample contains 15% silicone. The 3M adhesive contains only trace amounts of calcium, the pyrotechnic that provides the burn when mixed with oxygen providing perchlorate, 0.0220, while Sanders' sample contains 12% calcium. The 3M adhesive contains trace amounts of aluminum, Aluminum powder fuels rockets, 0.0065, while Sanders' sample contains 2.8% aluminum, unquote. I don't think they even disavowed either explanation. I think they just kept both of them, hoping people would cling to one of them. I'm still trying to figure out how both official explanations fit into the story. Were they saying that the supposed trace amounts of explosive material from the bomb sniffing test was somehow in the glue that was used on the seats? Like it spilled on the seats or something? It seems like the feds were scrambling for some type of reasonable answer they could shit out to the public to try and simmer things down. They said it was some type of industrial adhesive and only labs could test for it, which helped them somewhat control the narrative. Not fully though, as we've seen. One source told Sanders about a Coast Guard MP team, basically military police but for the Coast Guard, who were tasked with guarding debris that was found at the crash site, debris that did not go to the hangar with the other bits of wreckage. The source said this team met with guys from the CIA, telling them to keep their mouths shut, and if they didn't, it would be considered a violation of national security. The source also talked about Navy divers, who would bring pieces of wreckage to the surface, pieces with red residue. No one was allowed near the diving location. Residue was found on seats in rows 17, 18, and 19 in early August 1996, not even a month after the crash. The FBI took samples of this residue but refused to release the results at that time. I believe these were the same samples they eventually said were the adhesive, so at least they came up with an answer for us. There are at least two schools of thought in relation to the alternative missile theory. One, asserted by Jim Sanders in his book, talks about a missile penetrating the plane on the right side and exiting on its left side in front of the left wing. This event weakened the center fuel tank, causing it to eventually explode. As the missile traveled through the fuselage, it deposited the red residue. Also, the coroner in charge of the post-mortem examinations of the victims' bodies said that there is apparently no significant pattern of burn damage on the victims that could indicate an explosion in the cabin, and would not sign off on the official explanation, according to one of Sanders' sources. Victims with burns were found to be floating on the surface, which was ablaze in the ensuing hours after the crash. This would indicate that they were burned after the plane crashed into the ocean. Sanders' book came out in 1997, so it was working on fairly new information. I don't know if it's as accurate as the newer 3 missile theory, as that one has had years to be developed with information that came out in the subsequent years after the crash. It is important, and it does have interesting information though, some of which backs up the newer idea of the 3 missile proximity explosions. This theory posits that the plane was hit by the proximity detonation of 3 missiles. 3 objects were seen rising from the ocean near the plane by eyewitnesses, with all 3 seen exploding near it. The first one exploding near the left wing of the plane, causing it to tilt to the left, releasing a thick mist of fuel, which eyewitnesses described as a cigar-shaped cloud or plume. Then, just fractions of a second later, a second missile exploded near the plane, possibly the center. Finally, the third missile exploded under the plane's nose, causing it to separate from the rest of the plane. The investigators determined that the center wing fuel tank explosion was low velocity, which means it exploded slower than the speed of sound. Radar readings show debris blew off the plane around Mach 4 or around 3,000 miles per hour, 4 times the speed of sound. The max speed of a 747 isn't even Mach 1, so how did debris speed up to Mach 4? It wasn't the center wing fuel tank explosion. The only logical explanation would be a high-speed explosion from something like a missile or missiles. Also, the NTSB investigators even admitted to finding the explosive red residue in 3 places. Former White House Press Secretary Pierre Salinger said he received documents from French intelligence showing that the US Navy shot down the plane. Obviously, the Navy denied these allegations. Quote, Admiral Christensen explained that the Navy only had 2 assets in the area that night, a P-3 Orion submarine hunting plane 80 miles south of the crash, and the missile cruiser Normandy, about 185 miles southwest. Both the Normandy and the P-3 would have been able to track a missile hitting Flight 800, but the Normandy, Christensen went on to say, was conducting a basic engineering casualty control exercise, which forced the ship's radar to be on low power. The Normandy's records, however, do not show any type of exercise during the time of the crash. There was no explanation I could find about if the P-3's radar was working or not. There were also discrepancies in how the Navy presented information. Quote, in a December 1996 letter to Congressman Michael Forbes, the Navy Department wrote that the P-3 Orion had flown directly over TWA just before the explosion and dropped sono buoys during a training portion of the flight. In February 1997, the Defense Department's General Counsel's office wrote that the P-3 was flying on a routine training flight approximately 55 miles southeast of the site. Nearly a year after the crash, the General Counsel's office reported, the Navy has confirmed that there were no submarines in the vicinity of the TWA Flight 800 at the time of the crash. Only 2 submarines were operating north of the Virginia Capes operating area at the time. These submarines were operating approximately 107 and 138 miles from the crash site, unquote. So in the previous quote, the Navy is saying that the Normandy was in the area of the crash, 185 miles away, but in the next quote, they're saying that the subs, which were closer to the crash site, were not in the area. Confuse, deny, confuse, and so on. The NTSB released radar data which showed that there was pretty much no Navy or air traffic in a 20-mile radius around the crash site. However, journalist Kelly O'Meara was able to get a hold of new radar data that showed traffic from a 22-mile radius to 35 miles in a military test site known as W105. So the NTSB released radar data was just miles shy of showing significant naval activity. Just a little hiccup, right? Just a little coincidence. Before O'Meara's story came out, the NTSB had also found 4 vessels within a 6-mile radius of the plane. In a phone conversation with Tom Stalcup, NTSB Radar Data Group Chairman Charlie Pereira confirmed the findings. Also, Acting Director of the FBI, Louis D. Schillerock, confirmed these findings in a letter to Ohio Representative James Traficant. The closest vessel left the area quickly and did not try to rescue any survivors, even though that's illegal and also very shitty. What vessel was this? And why did they leave instead of racing to the crash site? I'll let you be the judge of that. Do you remember Jim Kallstrom, the FBI chief we talked about earlier, who was in charge of the investigation? He told a reporter that the vessel heading away from the plane right after the crash was a helicopter. Then when pressed on if that was really the case, he said, quote, well, between you and I, the conventional wisdom was, although it's probably not totally provable, it was a helicopter, unquote. Jimmy Boy really sounded like he had a handle on the situation. The tampering with evidence claim that the FBI purports is ironic considering that FBI agents were seen taking pieces of wreckage from the hangar where the remains of the plane were stored. The FBI eventually supposedly caught 2 agents there early in the morning and put security cameras up, claiming the problem was solved. This definitely seems like 2 agents were planted in the hangar by the FBI, then they solved the problem by putting up their own security cameras. Similar to a create the problem then offer the solution type scenario. There was also the case of the FBI agent named Ricky Hahn, who was caught hitting pieces of wreckage with a hammer, reportedly trying to flatten them, possibly to make them more amicable to the official story? Maybe. I mean, probably. A senior NTSB investigator named Hank Hughes had notes upon notes of the FBI's mishandling of the investigation. An investigation that the FBI wasn't even supposed to be handling. It was the NTSB's job to determine what caused the plane to crash. The NTSB's eyewitness group, under Chairman Norm Weimeyer, released a report that talked about some of the eyewitnesses of the objects that allegedly hit Flight 800. It stated that 96 out of 102 eyewitnesses to the moments before the crash saw a streak of light rise from the surface of the ocean. After this report was released, Weimeyer was replaced by David Mayer, who created a new report, one that showed significantly less people seeing a streak of light. He most likely did this because less people seeing something makes it less credible, but also it's easier to discredit the lower amount of people that saw it. Mayer, in an NTSB board meeting presenting the final report on Flight 800, appealed to psychology, stating that, quote, people combine knowledge from various sources with their own personal experience to create memories, and it's been well documented that people's memories change over time. Even memories we are sure of can change over time. This is what I call Fed confusion speak, because it asserts that people are constantly confused about what they've seen if it doesn't line up with the official narrative, while also causing confusion. It's meant to obfuscate the situation further, while offering an explanation to the said confusing scenario. The people in charge love to use weaponized empathy. In a letter submitted at Jim Sanders' sentencing, the government talks about, quote, trauma visited upon the bereaved families of those who perished in the crash, whose grief was only exacerbated and prolonged by Mr. Sanders' dissemination of misinformation, unquote. This is to make anybody questioning the official narrative seem crass and evil. It turns curious individuals away from the questions that aren't answered, out of fear of being ostracized and hated. A petition was started to open the investigation back up, signed by some of the families of the victims of TWA 800, which does show that people who were affected greatly by the crash want answers too. The CIA was asked by the FBI to make an animation that showed what happened according to the official story. Of course, it was just a play to confuse people further and control the narrative.
CIA's conclusion? The eyewitnesses did not see a missile.
The CIA animation was based largely on the testimonies of eyewitnesses Dwight Brumley and Mike Wire. Although the eyewitnesses said they saw a flare-like object rising from the ocean's surface to meet the jetliner, the video's narrator said in so many words that what they actually saw was jet fuel streaming down from the crippled craft after it had exploded. Mike Wire is a Vietnam veteran who was working on a bridge on the south shore of Long Island at the time of the disaster. He had this to say after reviewing the video. The animation didn't match anything that I had seen in no way, but I just figured, well, let's just be quiet about it because they're still investigating, and it could be a story they could correct later on. Dwight Brumley was an active duty Master Chief in the U.S. Navy, flying on U.S. Air Flight 217 in the crash site area right before and during the time TWA 800 occurred. He was looking out his window when the tragedy occurred. He didn't think the animation was accurate either. For them to put that flare moving from my left to right is it's almost perpendicular to the path that I observed. What they're animating as a flare doesn't even get close to what I saw, not even close. There's no way that was headed east, northeast, unquote. If you're wondering why the CIA was asked to make the animation by the FBI, I'm right there with you. The CIA seems really involved with this crash for some reason. Obviously, the people affected the most in all this are the victims and their families. 230 people lost their lives because of a fuck-up by the most powerful military in the world, and because they didn't have the balls to come forward and admit to their mistake, loved ones of the victims still don't have closure. Watching the TWA 800 documentary humanized the victims, and it really hit home to me that 230 human beings died in a preventable crash. Sons, daughters, husbands, wives, parents. Lives taken too early for no reason at all. Some images of the bodies were shown and they're extremely gruesome. Bodies is a very loose term for some of these remains. The fact that the Navy and other agencies tried and ultimately succeeded in covering up this travesty should make any normal person's blood boil. If they can get away with this, what else have they got away with? What else will they get away with?